It is a little under an inch long. It weighs about half a gram, less than a paperclip. One end is a sharpened steel point. The other end is a set of 4 small fins, like a dart. On its own, it is almost nothing. You could hold 200 of them in one hand. There were 8,000 of them inside a single artillery shell. The Americans called it the Beehive, not because of the shape, but because of the noise. 8,000 steel darts leaving a gun barrel at once made a sound that the men who heard it described as a swarm. And when the round was first issued, a great many artillerymen thought it was an embarrassment. A howitzer is supposed to be 4 miles away. That is the entire point of artillery. If you are lowering the barrel to fire directly at men you can see with your own eyes, at 100 meters, then something has already gone very badly wrong. And a shell packed with steel nails was not a modern weapon. In an army that had nuclear artillery shells in its inventory, this was a crossbow. They were wrong about it. On the morning of the 21st of March, 1967, 450 American soldiers were attacked by roughly 2,500. By 9 o'clock that morning, 647 of the attackers were dead. And what the burial parties found afterwards became one of the most argued about descriptions to come out of the entire war. This is the story of the Beehive round. But to understand why it existed at all, you have to start with the fire support base. An American fire support base in Vietnam was, in essence, a clearing. Engineers would cut a circle out of the jungle, usually on high ground, ring it with bulldozed earth and sandbags and belts of barbed wire, and put artillery inside it. 6 howitzers, sometimes more, a few hundred men to protect them. The purpose was reach. From inside that circle, the guns could support infantry operating anywhere within about 11 kilometers. A patrol in contact 5 miles away could get on the radio and shells would arrive in under 2 minutes. That is what artillery does. It kills people it cannot see, at distances measured in miles, using mathematics, which creates a very specific vulnerability, and both sides understood it perfectly. A howitzer cannot defend itself. The minimum range of a 105mm howitzer firing normally is measured in hundreds of meters. Inside that, the shell has not armed, the trajectory is useless, and the gun is nothing but a large steel tube. So a fire support base was a position holding enormous killing power that was completely useless against anything closer than its own wire. The North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong built an entire tactical doctrine around that single fact. Do not fight the guns at range. Get inside the range. Cross the last 200 meters as fast as possible, at night, in numbers. And once you are through the wire, the most powerful artillery on Earth is 6 pieces of scrap metal and a few hundred frightened men with rifles. It worked, repeatedly. The answer the Americans eventually arrived at was to give the howitzer a shotgun shell. The concept was not new. It was in fact very old, and the last time anyone had tried it seriously, it had failed completely. In the First World War, both sides dropped steel darts from aircraft. They were called flechettes, from the French for little arrow. The theory was that a dart falling from 2,000 feet would reach a speed sufficient to pass through a man and possibly through the horse he was sitting on. It did work, occasionally. But an aeroplane could carry only a few hundred. They scattered across enormous areas, and there was no way to aim them at anything. By 1918, the idea had been quietly abandoned as a curiosity. What changed between then and the 1960s was not the dart. It was everything around the dart. The problem with the flechette had never been the flechette. It was delivery. How many you could put into the air at once, how fast they were traveling, and whether you could aim the cone they made. An artillery shell solves all 3. The round was designated the M546, and to a gun crew, it looked almost identical to any other shell. Same brass case, same length. The difference was entirely inside. Behind the nose sat 8,000 flechettes, packed in layers inside a canister. with a small expelling charge behind them. The fuse was the important part. It was mechanical, and it was time set, which meant the gunner chose how far the shell would travel before it opened. He set it by hand by twisting a ring in a few seconds. He could set it to open at 1,000 meters. He could set it to open at 300, or he could set it to 0 and the round would open at the muzzle. At that setting, the howitzer stopped being artillery. It became the largest shotgun ever fired by a human being. When the charge went, the canister ruptured and the flechettes came out in a cone at well over 1,000 meters per second. At 100 meters, that cone was several meters across. At 300, wider still and thinning. 8,000 steel darts, fins stabilized so they flew point first instead of tumbling, crossing open ground in less than 1/3 of a second. And they made a noise on the way. A high, dense hum, thousands of small fins cutting the air at once. That is where the name came from. Not the shape of the shell, the sound of it arriving. American gun crews had a standing procedure for it. Before firing, the gunner would shout one word 3 times as loudly as he could, so that anyone outside the gun pit knew to get flat. Beehive, beehive, beehive. There was a reason that warning existed. The men on the receiving end never got one. Which brings us to a clearing in Tay Ninh province, and the morning that ended the argument. Fire support base Gold had been cut out of the jungle 2 days earlier, beside a stream called Soi Tre, about 80 kilometers northwest of Saigon. Inside it were the 3rd Battalion of the 22nd Infantry and the 2nd Battalion of the 77th Artillery, around 450 men, and 6 105mm howitzers. The position had gone badly from the start. On the first day, 2 helicopters coming into the landing zone had set off command-detonated mines. The base was undermanned. Its nearest reinforcements were hours away by road, and the jungle came up close to the wire on every side. The 9th Division of the Viet Cong had been watching the clearing since the day it was cut. At 6:31 in the morning, on the 21st of March, the mortars started. Somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 men of the 272nd Regiment came out of the tree line. They attacked from the east and southeast first, then from every direction at once, and they came through the wire in numbers that made the wire irrelevant. Within the hour, the eastern perimeter had gone. The attackers were inside the base. Men were fighting between the gun pits. At that point, by every conventional measure, Fire Support Base Gold was lost. And the battery commander gave the order that artillery doctrine exists specifically to prevent. The howitzers were swung off their firing data and dropped to point at ground level. At men, the crews could see with their own eyes. They loaded Beehive. They fired it at ranges that in some cases were under 50 meters. Gun crews were shooting over open sights into a crowd, reloading, and firing again. Some of the guns were being fought over as they were served. There are accounts of a howitzer being loaded with enemy soldiers within a few meters of its trail legs. Mechanized infantry and armor broke through to the base at around 9 o'clock, having forded a river to reach it. The attack collapsed. The final count was 647 enemy dead on the ground. American losses were 31 killed and around 109 wounded. And now the thing that was found afterwards. The accounts from Soi Tre and from other actions where Beehive was fired at close range describe bodies at the edge of the clearing, pinned upright against trees by the flechettes. Darts driven through a man and into the wood behind him, holding him where he stood. That description has been repeated so often in so many places that it has become the single thing most people know about the round. It deserves some care. It appears overwhelmingly in soldiers' recollections rather than in ordnance reports. And a half-gram dart that has already passed through a human body does not have a great deal of energy left for driving into hardwood. But it is not physically absurd either. The flechettes leave the shell at extreme speed. They arrive in the thousands, and any dart that misses a body entirely or merely clips one reaches the tree line with almost all of its velocity intact. Photographs exist of trees behind flechette impact areas, standing bristling with them like pincushions. Whether or not any individual man was held upright by them, the underlying picture is accurate. The ground behind a Beehive strike was full of steel. What happened after Suoi Tre is that the argument stopped. The round had been introduced quietly and used sparingly. After March 1967, it became standard practice. Every fire support base in Vietnam kept Beehive stacked separately from the high explosive, at the gun, ready to load in seconds, because the situation it existed for did not give anybody minutes. A recoilless rifle version followed, carrying around 10,000 flechettes. Tanks got one, so did the 90mm. And the tactical problem, the North Vietnamese had built their entire doctrine around simply closed. Getting inside the minimum range of the guns had been the whole plan. It had been the reliable, repeatable weakness of every American fire support base in the country. After Beehive, crossing that last 200 meters was no longer the safe part of the attack. It was the worst part. Now look again at what the artillerymen had objected to. They said a shell full of steel nails was primitive. It was. A flechette is conceptually the same object as an arrow, and the Beehive round is a device for firing 8,000 arrows at once. There is nothing in it that a Roman engineer would not have understood on sight. They said lowering the barrel to fire at people you could see was an admission of failure. It was that too. Nobody at Suoi Tre chose to fight that way. And they said it was a step backwards for an army that had nuclear shells in its inventory. That was also correct, and completely beside the point, because the problem the American army actually had in Vietnam was never a shortage of destructive power. It had more of that than any force in history. The problem was that all of it was pointed at the wrong distance. Every advance in artillery for 400 years had been about reaching further away. And the thing that kept killing Americans was people at 50 meters. The Beehive round was not an advance. It was an army finally admitting which direction the danger was actually coming from. There is one last thing worth knowing. The flechette never went away. Beehive rounds stayed in American stocks for decades after Vietnam, and flechette munitions are still manufactured and still fired today, where their use has drawn repeated legal challenge on the grounds that a weapon scattering thousands of unguided darts across an area cannot meaningfully distinguish a soldier from anyone else standing near him, which is, of course, precisely what it was designed to do. The round was never meant to be accurate. It was meant to fill a space. That turns out to be a very difficult thing to write a rule around, and 60 years on, nobody has managed it. The Beehive round has never been banned. It has simply been argued about, continuously, since the morning it worked. 8,000 steel darts, a name borrowed from an insect, and a design that a bowyer in the 14th century would have recognized immediately. The oldest idea on the battlefield, and it is still there. If you found this one interesting, subscribe for more stories about the weapons everybody underestimated.